I want you to think of the private thoughts you have each day. The ones you keep to yourself, and often for good reasons. Like your true feelings about the food that your friend cooked for you and they're really proud of. Or the attraction you feel to that one person who isn't your partner. We all have these kind of feelings and thoughts that we decide not to share, and it's comforting to think that they're ours and ours alone, right? But what if I told you that soon your thoughts will not be that private anymore? That new technology is making them more transparent than ever, and that this technology is already becoming a part of our lives? Well, if your thoughts right in this moment are what this man up on stage is talking about sounds a lot like science fiction, that's all right. I've heard that once or twice in my career. I'm a journalist and a futurist, which means that I investigate the present to make predictions for the future. And in order to do that, to make these predictions, one of the methods I use is to look for moments of convergence. Moments in time when technologies from different fields that seem somehow unrelated merge, when they come together, and together they spark something completely new. Now, in history, it's often been these kind of convergences that have led to major disruptions. In the last century, we saw how radio transmission technology, satellite technology, and Einstein's theory of relativity converged into GPS. And then at the beginning of this century, we saw how newer forms of radio transmission technology converged with mobile processors and the World Wide Web into our smartphones that we use today. Now, I'm telling you this because I'm convinced that today we're standing at the brink of the next major convergence. It's a megatrend that I call mind-reading AI. New technologies that are getting better and better at understanding what we think and feel. I've spent the last few years investigating this, and I just published a book with my findings here in Germany, and today I want to take you inside this investigation. I want to show you breakthroughs that I found at the edges of research and development, and how these breakthroughs come with an enormous potential to do good, but also an enormous potential for abuse. And I want to start in the field that I know best, artificial intelligence. So, it was May of 2019, more or less 6 years ago, and this younger version of me was in Paris, and apparently excited to be in Paris. Now, I was working as the AI correspondent at Politico at the time, the first reporter with that title in the world. And the AI world was still very different. This was before ChatGPT. A lot of work was still considered blue sky research. And I had come to Paris to visit an AI lab run by Meta, which was still called Facebook at the time. Now, this lab was located in the heart of the city with views overlooking the rooftops, and some of the biggest names in the industry were working there. But as I interviewed them, I noticed something that I couldn't quite explain. Some of the work they were doing was more neuroscience than computer science, studying our intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, and I didn't understand why. Why would a company like Meta invest in this kind of work? So that was the moment when I decided to dig deeper. Then in the years since then, I kept following the work of this lab of Meta in Paris. And at some point, one group within this lab captured my attention in particular. They're a group working exactly at this intersection between neuroscience and artificial intelligence. And they're working on what's called brain decoders. Now, these brain decoders are essentially computer programs that analyze recordings of our brain activity. So the idea is to take a brain scan that was taken with brain imaging technology and then use AI to decode it, to understand what someone was hearing or seeing or thinking in the moment when this scan was taken. So imagine you're listening to a podcast, and at the same time, your brain activity is being recorded. Now, the idea is to take the scan of this, or to take this recording, and analyze it with this brain decoder to understand the content or reconstruct the content of what you were hearing in that moment. It's not an entirely new idea, but in the last couple of years, advances in AI have really pushed this line of research further, and the work of this group at Meta shows just how much. In 2022, they first decoded snippets of a podcast that people were listening to. Then, a year later, they already reconstructed versions of images that people had seen. And this year, just a few weeks ago, they published their latest results, in which they showed how they were able to reconstruct entire sentences that people were typing as their brain activity was being recorded. And they're also not the only one working on this. Around the world, there are other groups, both within private companies like Google or Stability AI, as well as in universities from Texas to Sydney. Now, to be clear, this is still early stage basic research. It's not that you can take, or it's not that they're doing a universal mind reading. It's not that you can take any brain scan, run it through one of those brain decoders, and understand what somebody was thinking. But they're getting better, and they're getting better fast. And part of the reason for why they're getting better fast is because there are so many people working on this, including companies. And this again raises the question of why. Why are they investing in this space? Well, I'll get back to it. But first, I want to take you somewhere else. So, in the work that I do, I often end up in fields that I didn't expect. But sometimes I also realize after a while that there were things happening right in front of my eyes all along that I didn't see because they somehow felt too obvious or too mundane. And this is something that's happened to me about 3 years ago. I was out for a walk with my sister here in Berlin. This is Edgar, by the way. And we were speaking about my research and the book and brain decoders and so on. And at some point, my sister stopped. And she pointed at this fitness wearable that she was wearing. And she said, you know, sometimes I'm really surprised by how much this thing already understands about what I'm feeling. And that stuck with me. And so I started looking into them, and then I realized how much these devices have evolved since they were first introduced. They started by tracking our physical health. Then they moved into our emotional states. That's what my sister was referring to, how stressed she was. And today, we're now seeing the first devices on the market that have sensors to directly measure brain activity as well. Now, these are 3 examples for headbands and then 3 examples for earphones. Now, I wouldn't call what these devices are doing mind reading. They're still pretty crude, but they will get better. And I think we have to look at them as a transition technology, as a technology that will normalize an idea that once seemed unthinkable, and that's that our brain is just another data stream that we can tap into with small devices that we carry around with us. And at some point, these devices might also be able to write into our brain. Which now brings me to the 3rd field that I wanted to show you, and that's medicine, specifically clinical neurotechnology and brain-computer interfaces, so devices to create a link between a computer and our nervous system. Now, this is a field that often flies sort of under the radar in the tech world, but when you take a closer look, you realize that a lot of breakthroughs in other fields actually build on things that happened here a couple of years ago. So this, for example, is a psychiatrist here in Germany, who already 10 years ago achieved really impressive results with brain-computer interfaces and exoskeletons. And so that's why I'm convinced that in order to understand what's going to happen in the next couple of years, we have to take a look at what's happening here at the edges of research in medicine. And that's why I want to do a little bit of a deep dive with you now. It'll be worth it, I promise. And also buckle up, because things will get a little wild. Now, when I said brain-computer interfaces, the first company that came to your mind was probably Neuralink, Elon Musk's company. Now, they grabbed a lot of attention when they implanted a device into the brain of this man, which now allows him to operate a computer with his thoughts. And these trials, of course, are impressive. But for me, as a futurist, there's actually another line of research that I find even more interesting. And that's work on what's called bidirectional brain-computer interfaces. So devices that work in both directions, that can both read out our brains, but also write into them and influence what we think. And there's one case that really brings this to life. Now, it's the case of this woman. Her name is Sarah. She had been suffering from severe depression for many years. She had tried all available treatment options. They had all failed. And she was at a point where she felt like she had reached the end of the road and that there was no future worth living. And so Sarah agreed to take part in a clinical trial. And in this trial, a team around this psychiatrist implanted a device into her brain. Now, this device would then monitor her brain activity, and whenever it would detect signs that a new depressive episode might be coming up, it would send this gentle pulse into the brain in order to steer the brain activity into a healthier direction. Now, it was an experiment, and it worked. From the moment this device was turned on, Sarah says her mood started to lift, and today she's living a fairly normal life. And this case really sent waves through the medical community, because in many ways, Sarah is living proof that these bidirectional brain-computer interfaces can work, that we can influence the way we perceive the world by specifically stimulating parts of our brain. Now, she's just one case. She had to undergo major surgery, which is both expensive and risky. And that means that this is just not an option for the vast majority of people. But what if we could achieve similar results with methods that are less expensive, less risky? That could make this kind of treatment available to so many more people, potentially also to those with less severe forms of depression, which is statistically 1 in 7 people in this audience. And it could also bring this kind of treatment to regions of the world where currently there is no access to mental health treatment. And that's why right now in the medical community we're seeing a massive push to develop these kind of non-invasive solutions. This, for example, is a US startup that's working on ultrasound sensors that only require you to drill a small window into the skull. And they just started a clinical trial in the UK together with the NHS. And then there's a whole group of other researchers who are working on completely non-invasive methods. So essentially devices that you can just put on, carry around with you, and use whenever necessary. And one of those people working on this is the psychiatrist, the German psychiatrist that I showed you earlier, Soyo Sokada, who's working just a few kilometers from where we are right now at the Charité, our university hospital here in Berlin. All right, so let's recap. We have these brain decoders that analyze brain activity and decode it. We have wearables that make it feel more and more normal that you can tap into your brain activity. And then we have this clinical neurotechnology that is able to write into our brains. And we're now at a moment in time where we're starting to see these different domains intersect, where we're starting to see them influence one another, where medical researchers are now collaborating with startups from the consumer space, or where they're drawing inspiration from AI research and those brain decoders. And so we're at a point where combining these breakthroughs has now become an engineering challenge. And once that's solved, we'll see a new type of technology that we can control with our thoughts. And this is the great disruption that this mind-reading AI will bring along. It will change the way we interact with computers. We won't type commands anymore or say them, we'll just think them. And at some point, computers will analyze our thinking and understand for themselves what we want from them. And already today, there are companies working on this kind of neuroadaptive technology. And once they succeed, once mind-reading AI is a reality, this will reshape so many aspects of our life. We could see surgeons who use operating robots that they guide with their thoughts. Or we could see pilots who work side-by-side autopilots that react to what they're thinking. And it's not just work. It's, in our personal lives, we might be wearing wearables that are connected to our smartphones or replace them at some point. And on these devices, we might be using silent messaging apps that allow us to think a message and send it without having to type anything. Or we could be living in homes that adapt lighting or music to how we're feeling. And remember that this technology can not only read out our brains, but also write into them, and that this is already helping patients like Sarah who are suffering from depression. Now, we could soon also see similar technology that's aimed at perfectly healthy people that would help us lift our moods when we're feeling down, or cure jet lag, or make us more focused. But as exciting as all of this sounds, this is also where we're starting to cross into ethically dangerous territory, because the same technology that helps us feel better could also be used to influence us. And if we go down that dystopian road, we may find ourselves in a world where all different kinds of actors are trying to manipulate our thoughts, where companies are trying to push us into buying their products, where political parties are trying to nudge us into supporting their positions. So, the closer you look, the more you realize how thin the line is between promise and peril. Already today, early versions of this technology are being used to treat soldiers suffering from PTSD. But militaries are also working on similar technology that they could use on soldiers during combat, to dull their fears, to make them more aggressive, to keep them going even when they're exhausted. Now, I could go on and on. The list of possible applications seems endless. And that shows us just how massive this potential market is. And this brings us back to the question of why. Why are companies investing in this space? Well, it's this market. And let's also not forget about the data. This mind-reading AI will create incredibly granular, intimate information about us. Data about how we feel, what we like, who we are. This is a goldmine for the data industry. And it could also become the fuel for the next generation of AI. We're at a point where companies have essentially run out of new training data, and they're desperately looking for new sources. Brain data could be exactly that. It's a new category of data that could allow them to train super personalized AI, so systems that get better at knowing us with every thought that we make. Well, so much for the industry, but what about us? What will this do to us and our thinking and the way we think? Well, there are so many implications. I wrote an entire book about it. And if you're wondering why on earth there's a photo of Patagonia behind him now, those of you who read my book know why. I want to point out two implications here. And the first one is sort of the obvious one. The more thinking we delegate to machines, the more we risk losing it. Our brain is no muscle, but just like muscles can waste away if we don't exercise, our cognitive abilities can weaken if we don't use them. And in a way, we're already seeing that today. We're already seeing people who feel overwhelmed when they have to do simple tasks like writing an email or even picking their outfit for the day without the help of ChatGPT. Well, and then there's a second consequence, and that's one that has received no attention so far. There is sort of a universal truth about things that make us feel better at the push of a button, and that's that they can be dangerously addictive. Now, devices that help us lift our mood are doing just that. And every mental health researcher I talked to, every single one, was deeply concerned when I told them about what I had found out. And they said, it's essentially not a question of if people will get hooked to this, but how many. So, what now? How can we harness the potential of this technology while at the same time protecting our thoughts? Well, we need to start having a conversation about what's acceptable and what isn't. Because if we're not making these decisions, a few companies will make them for us. We need to speak about the new type of questions raised by this technology. Questions like questions about mental privacy. So, how do we protect ourselves from others spying on our thoughts? Questions about neurosecurity. How do we make sure no one's stealing that data? And perhaps most importantly, questions about our cognitive liberty. How do we ensure that no one is manipulating our thoughts? And yes, this also means speaking about laws, whether we have to update our existing laws or whether we might even need new laws. There is one country in the world that has already made this step, and that's Chile. As the first country in the world, Chile has added an amendment to its constitution, specifically recognizing neuro rights, and we need to start having a debate about that here as well. And if your reaction now is more regulation, more rules, don't we already have enough of them? I mean, I hear you, and let me be clear here, I'm certainly not a fan of over-regulation. There are so many good things we can do with this technology, and we have to make sure that rules won't stop us from doing them. But this isn't about red tape. This is about the freedom of our thoughts, a principle so important that back in 1948, the United Nations included it in their Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not knowing what kind of technologies would emerge almost 8 decades later, but sending a message to later generations, to us, that it's worth defending this. And in many ways, this moment now reminds me of a moment from previously in my career. Back in 2018, I published this article about fully autonomous weapons, better known as killer robots. So fully like weapon systems that use AI and can kill on their own. Now, in this article, I was making the point that these weapon systems could soon appear on battlegrounds, and I was quoting several experts who urged that international rules were needed for that. Well, the reaction I got to this article was familiar. People were intrigued. They said it sounded like science fiction, and it fizzled. Today, these weapon systems are a reality in wars around the world, and the talks for international rules, they're still ongoing, but it's fair to say that they have largely failed. I think we're standing at a similar crossroads with mind-reading AI today. We can either act now, or we can look back in a couple of years from now and wonder why we didn't. And yet, I'm also convinced that regulation is only part of the answer, because at the end of the day, the decision over how much access we grant others to our thoughts is not a decision that any government in the world should ever make. It's a decision that each one of us should make for themselves. But in order to make this decision, people need to understand how this technology works. They need to understand how it can help them, but how it can also be used against them. And they need to learn how to use it in a way that's healthy. This kind of AI literacy is going to become more important than ever, and we need to start building it now. We need to democratize it. We need to take this conversation beyond the tech world. We need to bring it to dinner tables, to classrooms, and we also need to bring it into underserved regions of the world and underserved communities who are often the first to feel the negative impact of new technologies. I love technology. I'm amazed by what we can do with AI today. And I'm genuinely excited about what mind-reading AI will soon make possible. But the risks are real. We're headed towards a world where we might look free, but our thoughts aren't. And we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? The freedom of our thoughts is one of our greatest assets, perhaps the greatest one of all. And now it's up to us to protect it. Thank you.